Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen, Anderson, Bates, Bell, Berryhill, Block, Cannella, De Leon, Fuller, Gaines, Galgiani, Glazer, Hall, Hancock, Hernandez, Hertzberg, Hill, Hueso, Huff, Jackson, Latta, Leno, Leyva, Liu, McGuire, Mendoza, Mitchell, Monning, Morlock, Morrill, Wynn, Nielsen, Pan, Pavley, Roth, Runner, Stone, Vidak, Wachowski, Wolk.
Colleagues, please come down to the Senate floor. We have a busy and a rather lengthy day today, so the sooner we can get started, the sooner we can start the business of the people. Senators, please to the Senate floor for our 9 a.m. session. All senators to the Senate floor. Mr. Secretary, please call the roll.
Allen, Anderson, Bates, Bell, Berryhill, Block, Cannella, De Leon, Fuller, Gaines, Galgiani, Hall, Hancock, Hernandez, Hertzberg, Hill, Hueso, Huff, Jackson, Latta, Leno, Leyva, Liu, McGuire, Mendoza, Mitchell, Monning, Morlock, Morrill, Wynn, Nielsen, Pan, Pavley, Roth, Runner, Stone, Vidak, Wachowski, Wolk.
A quorum is present. Would the members and our guests beyond the rail and in the gallery please rise? We will be led in prayer today by our guest chaplain, Senator Gaines. And after which, please remain standing. We will be led in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag by Senator Roth.
Dear members, let us pray. Dear God, thank you for this day and the opportunity to serve in the legislature. We pray for every member here in the legislature, for the governor, for our families, for our friends. We pray especially for the horrific massacre in South Carolina and the impacted families and the impact on our nation. That our nation will remain one, that we would be one in spirit and across all racial lines, that those would be diminished and we would serve as one within our nation. And I'd like to close this prayer with a reading from Matthew chapter 5, verses 3 through 10. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the weak, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Amen.
Amen. Senator Huff, for what purpose, sir?
Republican caucus in the Cox Lounge.
Thank you, Senator Huff. There will be a Republican caucus in the Cox Lounge. All right, colleagues. Messages from the governor will be deemed read. Messages from the assembly will be deemed read. Reports of committee will be deemed read. On consideration of the daily file, Mr. Secretary, please read.
Assembly Bill 389 with amendments, 1231 with amendments.
The second reading
1424.
file will be deemed read. Under Assembly third reading, if you would just wait, we will start the Assembly third reading very shortly. All right, Senators, there is a message from the Assembly. A message from the Assembly. Mr. Secretary, please read.
Madam President, I am directed to inform your honorable body that the Assembly amended and on this day passed as amended SB 83, SB 97, SB 79, and respectfully request your honorable body to concur in said amendments. Above bills ordered to unfinished business file.
All righty. With that, Senator Leno. SB 97 without reference to file. Mr. Secretary, please read.
Senate Bill 97 by the Committee on Budget, an act relating to the state budget and making appropriation therefore to take effect immediately. Budget bill.
Senator Leno.
Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, Senators. This bill is otherwise known as our Budget Bill Junior and represents the compromise that has been reached between the governor and the two houses of the legislature. It maintains the fiscal framework of the May revision with regard to the revenue forecasts that the Department of Finance had put out, also the $1.1 billion in operating reserve, also the debt repayment as a result of Proposition 2, and also monies in our rainy day fund. And since we went over much of the detail on Monday, I do just want to point out, given that the nature of compromise is that no one gets everything that he or she wants, and that's what's before us. But there are major three components of this bill, of which we should all take great pride. Of course, as a result of Proposition 98, we have now $68 billion for K through 14 education, raising our per pupil investment to over $10,000, an increase of 15% in just the past 2 years alone. But of those three major victories, I want to touch on major step forward we've made in reinvesting in early care and education. This compromise provides for 7,000 additional full-day preschool slots, along with 6,800 restored childcare slots and rate increases for all providers. Again, not all that we had wanted and passed in our conference report, but this is a very significant victory in our compromise. Also, the largest investment in higher education that we have seen in a long time. An additional 5,000 spots at the University of California, another 10,000 at the California State University in increased enrollment. The $216 million increase in the CSU budget is the largest in a decade. Also provides for 3,250 additional competitive Cal Grant awards. For the first time ever, we'll be investing in health care for all of California's children by extending health care coverage to 170,000 immigrant children. The fact of this will keep our schools and will keep our communities healthier because, of course, viruses and bacterial infections know and respect no immigration status. The governor has called for 2 special sessions as well. I know that our disappointment in the lack of reinvestment in reimbursement rates in Medi-Cal and also in our developmental disability communities has been a disappointment for all of us in this room, irrespective of party affiliation. I want to give some hope to those who were disappointed in our communities that this is not the end of the debate, this is the beginning of rolling up our sleeves and getting down to work and making some important decisions that will reach our goal of accomplishment. With regard to the special session for health care rates, by calling the special session, the governor has linked directly the need for a new and dedicated revenue source to pay for the cost of the increased reimbursement rates. We know we rank about 50 states for our Medi-Cal providers. This is unsustainable. We've expanded access to Medi-Cal for over 1 million Californians, now representing a third of our population, almost half of our children. We need to pay our providers significantly more than we are currently, along with the recognition that as we, and we'll get to this in one of the trailer bills, shift, as the federal government is also forcing us to do, from a statewide to a community-based care of service for individuals in the developmentally disabled community, that we can get better results, provide greater opportunity for life's fulfillments in community settings, that as we put out a plan to move away from our developmental centers to our regional centers, that we recognize, as I know all of us do, we cannot let that community-based infrastructure die on the vine. It is on life support as we speak. But again, it will take a funding source to be able to have a sustainable way to fund that shift. That will be the purpose of the special session. And this is not a special session that will wait until we conclude our year's work in September. It's going to begin immediately in the month of July. So with all of that, there is much to be proud of. Yes, much to be disappointed about as well, but that is our process. And I want to again thank the hard work of all of our Budget Committee chairs, our Budget Committee members, the Conference Committee, and working with the administration in a very accomplished way for the needs and the benefits of the people of the state of California. I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you, Senator Leno. Debate or discussion? Senator Nielsen, followed by Senator Huff.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, Senator Leno spoke to the spirit of compromise. And it might surprise people as the Conference Committee dealt with the budget item by item by item. Far more did we agree on than disagree. And those that we disagreed were not really too passionate. But we're pleased that in the budget, after the Conference Committee report, the governor intervened and his lower revenue expectation figure prevailed. That makes this budget much less risky. We're not assuming monies that are not there. We are not spending and creating obligations that we cannot meet. So this is about $2.3 billion below what that former Conference Committee report would have spent. Affirming the wisdom of the people in this legislature of last year, Proposition 2's passage, the Rainy Day Fund will squire away $3.5 billion, not for anticipated spending, but for emergency situations that we cannot anticipate, to keep our budget in balance. And that kind of has worked as a lever, as a governor, in our budget getting out of control. The wall of debt is going to be chewed away to the tune of some $7 billion, and some of the mandates that have been long suffered upon local government and education are going to be taken care of. It still, though, represents about a 7% increase over last year's budget. That may be of some concern in these times. But what our revenue picture has clearly shown is that there is no great need for massive tax increases. And we would set the stage for saying that the temporary tax increase proposed in Proposition 30 should be respected. It should not be renewed. The Department of Finance testified in the Budget Subcommittee that the governor's position was not to renew Proposition 30. So I think we've made a step here for a responsible budget. Some of us will have problems with some of the other provisions, but this is a good effort. And I want to thank Senator Leno. He really went out of his way to be helpful, he and his staff, to allow the minority party to get documents to review in as timely a fashion as we could hope. We've not been treated that way so well in the past, and I thank you, Senator Leno. And you went out of your way to be courteous in committee. I particularly will compliment him for last night, a very controversial bill we'll be dealing with later related to water, and it was a kind of a rush job, and he allowed everybody who was there that wanted to testify to have that opportunity. I thank you for that. It's good for the people of California. I urge an aye vote on this bill.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Senator Huff, followed by Senator Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam President. Members, we have a majority vote budget, and as such, the minority party often doesn't have a voice in what the outcome is in a budget. Now, sure, we raise our mics and we articulate our priorities, and we howl a little bit every now and then, but what you see reflected today, this is actually cutting back some, so I do support this budget bill before us. But just to differentiate, you know, we will be going into 2 extraordinary sessions to deal with transportation, to deal with health, specifically to deal with new funding sources or taxes. Just off the get-go, we would say those should have been folded into the regular budget process, but it's not. We'll deal with it separately. The assumption is there'll be new funding for that outside of this budget, which already includes an unanticipated $14 billion worth of revenue. Other priorities that we have that are different from the majority party, the Democrat budget plan prioritizes $132 million to expand Medi-Cal to cover undocumented immigrants, but there are 12.4 million Californians who depend on Medi-Cal right now that have difficulty accessing doctors and services because our reimbursement rates are too low. Republicans would instead use those funds to provide a Medi-Cal provider rate so that 12.4 million Californians already enrolled can actually get the health care services they need. Democrat budget plan prioritizes $226 million to grow service hours for unionized in-home support service providers, despite an existing legal settlement in which the reduction was agreed upon by all stakeholders. Republicans would instead use that money to provide rate increases for community providers that serve our most vulnerable Californians, the developmentally disabled, who are largely ignored in this budget despite the critical needs in that community. The Democrat budget plan prioritizes $211 million for salary and benefit increases for state workers, even though California's public employees are among the highest paid in the nation, and they continue to get salary increases throughout the state's fiscal crisis as other programs got cut. Republicans would instead use that money to provide a much-needed cost of living adjustment to aged, blind, and disabled Californians on supplemental Social Security income state supplementary payment, commonly referred to as SSI-SSP. The Democrat budget plan prioritizes $22 million to provide welfare benefits to drug felons, despite the obvious likelihood that those funds will be misused. Republicans would instead use that money to fund innovative welfare program grants through the CalWORKS program, such as SB 659 by Senator Bates, which rewards programs that demonstrate effectiveness in moving people off welfare and into self-sufficiency, as has always been the goal of welfare to work programs. The Democrat budget plan prioritizes $500 million for teacher effectiveness grants that are not the highest priority for many California school districts. Republicans would instead give that money to school districts to spend on their highest priorities. Democrat budget plan prioritizes $6 million for UC labor union institutes, which subsidizes union efforts to expand unionization and increase taxes on hardworking Californians by writing self-serving and biased research reports. Republicans would tell the unions pay for their own research. Use that money instead to admit 600 more California students to the UC. Democrat budget plan prioritizes $500 million for 3,500 Caltrans state employee positions within the capital outlay support program that the LAO has identified as unnecessary. Republicans would instead use that money for badly needed transportation infrastructure projects to maintain, repair, and expand our state's highways and roads. Democrat budget plan prioritizes $1.9 billion of revenues from the cap and trade program, the hidden tax for the high-speed rail project that actually increases greenhouse gases, and other projects that provide questionable benefits. Republicans would instead use that money for badly needed transportation infrastructure projects to maintain, repair, and expand our state's highways and roads. So yes, our priorities are different. That's how we would spend some of this, but that's not before us. What we do have before us right now is a bill that actually trims back expenses of state government. We do support that, I support that, and ask for your aye vote on this particular bill.
Thank you, Senator Huff. Senator Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And while I do not want to associate my comments with some of the comments made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I do feel compelled to acknowledge some of the shortcomings in today's budget. It's clear to me that this compromise, compared to what we had the opportunity to vote on Monday, continues to pick winners and losers. And it appears to me that poor people in California and their children continue to be on the losing end of that equation. When I entered the legislature 5 years or so ago now, we were still in the tail end of the depths of the state's Great Recession, and I had to continue to vote and make cuts on programs that I know are life-saving and life-sustaining for millions of Californians, and that was very difficult to do. But I only was able to muster the strength to do that because I knew that the state was taking actions, that the economy was in a recovery, and we'd be in a position to once again invest in California's core commodity, which are Californians. We were able to do that to some degree last year, and the hundreds of hours of work that went in through the subcommittee process, the conference committee process, resulted in a document that we all looked at and voted on Monday that reflected some key investments. Unfortunately, the bill before us today reverses some of those critical key investments. And while the chair of the Budget Committee, was able to outline what this bill contains, I think we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge what is no longer in it, what's been removed through the negotiations. And to acknowledge the fact that we as a state will continue to make history, not new history, but will continue to make history as the state in the nation with the highest child poverty rate. And I don't know how many of you are embarrassed or offended by that, but the fact that there are 2 million California children who live in poverty or deep poverty is offensive to me. What's poverty, Senator Mitchell? For a parent with 2 children earning $20,000 a year, the federal government deems that 100% of the poverty level. Deep poverty is a parent with 2 children attempting to manage on $10,000 a year.
Just impossible.
And in California, there are over 2 million children who live that reality every day. On our CalWORKs program, a parent with 2 children earn approximately $464 a month. You do the math, that puts them below deep poverty. And that adds to that $2 million number. So what does this budget do to impact that population? I would argue very little. There are aspects of this budget that are admirable. The chair of the Senate Budget already detailed those. But what's missing? Conference report included a really important, I would argue reasonable, strategic investments in the Department of Developmental Disabilities. It included rate increases for supported living services, employment services, respite services, transportation services, a regional coordinator for dental services. It included across the board for all providers not covered under the initial increase, and it included an increase for regional centers' core staffing formula. While we're told this issue will be taken up in the special session doesn't have a constitutionally required date by which we have to take action. The budget does continue to include a plan for developmental center closure. So one hand of the equation is dealt with while the other is ignored. What we voted on Monday included a reasonable investment for CalWORKs housing, the Emergency of Food Assistance Program. The nature of that program is reflected in its name alone, Emergency Food Assistance. Funding to expand outreach for foster parents, where counties across the state don't have enough adequately trained foster parents to provide the critical needs to the kids in our care. This budget removes the elimination of the 24-hour clock. The 24-hour clock is something we put into place, again, when we were hemorrhaging financially as a state. But we failed to keep our promise to these families. We told these families, we're going to put you on a 24-month clock for CalWORKs. But within that 24-month period, we're going to make sure that we invested you on the front end to increase the likelihood that you're successful in 24 months and can transition off of cash aid and take care of your families. Well, guess what? We haven't finished any of the intake process, all of the things we said we were going to do to help them with this transition. The Department of Social Services has not rolled out, but the clock is ticking. This bill fails to remove the 24-month clock, which I could argue would plummet more families into deep poverty. As the clock runs out, we fail to provide them the support to be successful, but they will end their CalWORKs experience. This bill eliminated the increase to critical after-school funding, an after-school program that I have direct experience with, ran one before I became an elected official, that provides critical services statewide, operating off of funding at a 10-year-old level. We eliminated that increase. SSI and SSP, we eliminated the increase to our elderly, aged, blind, disabled, and frail. And finally, MFG, that you all, I'm sure, are sick of hearing me talk about, the Maximum Family Grant in CalWORKs. The counties of Del Norte, Fresno, Merced, Tulare, thank you, all have some of the highest percentages of CalWORKs recipients compared to their population. All of those counties I just mentioned, 8% of their entire county population are CalWORKs recipients. And so as we talk about a recovery, as we talk about this budget that does some good, we have to remember those people. Early care and education, this budget contains an investment of half of what we agreed to out of conference and we passed on Monday, half the investment. And so while those 7,000, 5,000 slots are a step forward, it's a small step as we try to rebuild on the 120,000 slots we lost beginning in 2008. So colleagues, I share these stats with you because it's hard for me to celebrate many of the gains contained in this budget because it continues to ignore the most vulnerable in our state. We continue to say next year, next year, next year. I'm not sure when next year will come for the children who can't get a seat in an early care and education environment, for the mothers and fathers who are continuing to try to provide care to their infants born once they were on CalWORKs on $464 a month, for those who will be transitioning out of the developmental centers into a community setting that we have failed to invest in and bolster to make sure that we meet their needs, for our seniors and our aged, blind, and disabled who are expected to live and pay rent and function in our communities at rates that have seen no COLA and no increase in decades. Again, in an era when we saw just shy of a $7 billion increase, in an era where we recognize that all of the revenue are based on estimates, they're all based on estimates. Finance doesn't have any magic formula that LAO doesn't. Why we wouldn't have the courage and the will to put the needs of the people I just identified at the top of the list, as opposed to continuing to pick winners and losers, and these folks continuing to end up at the bottom of the list, continues to disappoint me as a Californian and as a state legislator. And I ask that we're all mindful of these people and these facts as we decide whether or not we're going to cast our vote for this compromise.